You are standing on a coral airstrip on Bougainville. It is 12:47 in the afternoon, January 3rd, 1944. The air smells of aviation gasoline and burnt palm. Somewhere in the jungle beyond the wire, cicadas are screaming in the heat. The last Corsair has landed. Its engine ticks as it cools, and one plane is missing. You are a marine mechanic, 20 years old. You have been rearming Major Boyington's aircraft for 4 months. You know his call sign. You know the way he taxis. You know the sound of his engine from a mile out over the jungle. He is not coming. Around you, 100 pilots stand on the runway. Nobody moves, nobody walks to chow. A war correspondent from the Associated Press has been waiting since dawn for the record-breaking headline. Marine ace ties Rickenbacker. His notebook is still open. His pencil is still in his hand. 300 miles north, over the Japanese fortress at Rabaul, a 31-year-old Marine major has just shot down his 26th enemy aircraft, tying the American all-time ace record set by Eddie Rickenbacker in the last war. He has done what every young pilot in the Pacific has dreamed of doing. And then, in the very moment of that record, he has disappeared. Nobody in this squadron will ever see him again. At least, that is what everyone believes for the next 20 months. This is the true story of Marine Fighter Squadron 214, the Black Sheep. The Corsair pilots the Japanese called Whistling Death, and the man they called Pappy, who came back from the dead. To understand what happened over Rabaul that morning, you have to understand two things. You have to understand the airplane, and you have to understand the man. Start with the airplane. In the spring of 1940, on a runway in Stratford, Connecticut, a chance Vought chief designer named Rex Basel watched his prototyped fighter climb into the sky for the first time. It was ugly. Its wings bent downward and then leveled off, a shape aviation historians would call the inverted gull. The reason for that strange geometry was simple. The airplane carried the largest propeller ever bolted to an American fighter, and the engineers needed the tips of that propeller to clear the ground. Under the cowl sat the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 2,000 horsepower of 18-cylinder radial engine, capable of pushing the aircraft past 400 miles per hour. When American test pilots first flew the prototype, they thought they had been handed the fastest fighter in the world, but the United States Navy did not want it. On aircraft carriers, the Corsair was a killer of its own pilots. Its long nose blocked the view of the deck on landing. Its landing gear bounced on impact. Oil leaked from the cowling and coated the windshield of the pilot behind it. In 1942, the Navy deferred the F4U from carrier operations, prioritizing the F-6F Hellcat, and handed the Corsair over to the United States Marine Corps for land-based use. The Marines took what the Navy did not want, and, on the coral runways of Guadalcanal, they turned it into the most feared fighter in the... According to Allied accounts, Japanese pilots on Bougainville, hearing the wind whistling through the oil cooler intakes at the roots of those bent wings, gave it a name: Whistling Death. That is the machine, now the man. Gregory Boyington was born on December 4, 1912, in a small lumber town in northern Idaho called Coeur d'Alene. His mother and stepfather were both heavy drinkers. He was left alone for long hours, and he filled that time by doing things that terrified the neighbors. If there was a cliff nearby, Gregory climbed it. If there was a tree, he found the tallest one. And if that tree happened to be growing on the edge of a cliff, so much the better. He climbed grain elevators. He walked a wooden beam from the top of one grain elevator to another, 40 feet above the railroad tracks, for no reason other than to prove to his friends that he could. In the autumn of 1919, a barnstormer landed a war surplus Curtiss Jenny biplane in a field outside town. 6-year-old Gregory convinced the pilot to take him up. It was the first airplane he had ever seen. 69 years later, at the end of his life, he would still remember the shape of the horizon from that cockpit. As a young man, he moved to Seattle. He studied engineering at the University of Washington. He took a job as a draftsman at the Boeing Corporation. He got married, quickly, and to a woman named Helene Clark, and he was bored out of his mind. That was when he saw the notice from the United States Marine Corps. The Marines were recruiting flight cadets at Pensacola, Florida, the finest naval aviation school in the world. But there was a regulation. Marine flight cadets could not be married. Gregory Boyington was married. He had a child on the way. He applied anyway, under his legal name, Gregory Hallenbeck. And here is where the first strange thing happened. Somewhere in the process of pulling documents for his cadet file, Gregory was asked to produce a birth certificate. He wrote to the county clerk in Coeur d'Alene. The clerk wrote back, there was no record of any Gregory Hallenbeck born on December 4th, 1912. He wrote to his mother. His mother told him the truth. His name was not Hallenbeck. His name was Boyington. She had divorced his real father, a man named Charles Boyington, when Gregory was too young to remember. She had remarried Ellsworth Hallenbeck, and she had raised her son under the new name without ever telling him what his real name was. Gregory Boyington had been living inside another man's identity for 23 years. He did not tell his wife. He did not tell his employer. He refiled his cadet application under the name Boyington, and because his marriage certificate was registered under the name Hallenbeck, the United States Marine Corps had no way of knowing that the young cadet reporting to Pensacola in the summer of 1935 was already a husband and would soon be a father. He became a Marine on a technicality built on a lie his mother had told him about who he was. He served for 6 years. He drank. He fought with his wife. He accumulated debts he could not pay. By the summer of 1941, Gregory Boyington was on the verge of being cashiered from the Marine Corps for financial misconduct. He had 3 children now. His marriage was collapsing, and he was, in his own words, drowning. One night in Pensacola, Boyington walked into the San Carlos Hotel and cashed a bad check for $20. He walked into the bar, and in that bar, he heard about a man upstairs who was hiring pilots. The man was a recruiter for a private military organization called the American Volunteer Group, soon to become famous around the world as the Flying Tigers. Their mission was to fly obsolete Curtiss P-40 fighters against the Imperial Japanese Army over China and Burma. The pay was $600 a month, 3 times a Marine major's salary, and the Chinese government offered a bonus of $500 for every enemy aircraft shot down. For a broke 30-year-old with 3 children, the offer was not a career decision. It was an escape. Boyington resigned his Marine commission. He boarded a merchant ship in San Francisco, and in September of 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, he arrived in Burma. He did not fit in. Boyington argued with the commander of the American Volunteer Group, Claire Chennault, a hard-nosed retired Army airman who had built the Flying Tigers into a functional fighting force through sheer willpower. Chennault did not tolerate insubordinate pilots. Boyington did not tolerate being told what to do. By April of 1942, after less than a year in China, Boyington had been dropped from the flight roster. Fellow AVG pilots would later testify that he sometimes reported for duty in no condition to fly. He was quietly encouraged to leave. He walked out of the Flying Tigers without formal permission, made his way overland to India, and bought passage home on the American steamer SS Brazil. Officially, he had been credited with 2 aerial victories in Chinese combat, though he would later claim 6. Unofficially, he had been fired. Back in the United States, the Marine Corps was fighting for its life. Guadalcanal had been invaded. Marine fighter pilots were dying in staggering numbers. Boyington assumed he would be reinstated immediately. He was wrong. While his former classmates deployed to the South Pacific, Gregory Boyington, combat veteran, Flying Tiger, former Marine officer, 30 years old, took a job as an attendant at a parking garage in downtown Seattle. He parked other men's cars for the next 12 months. That is where the true story of the Black Sheep Squadron actually begins. One night in the summer of 1942, Gregory Boyington sat down in a rented room in Seattle with a bottle of bourbon and a sheet of paper. He drank the bottle. He wrote the letter. The letter was addressed to Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy of the United States of America. In it, Boyington claimed 6 aerial victories with the Flying Tigers. He asked for one thing: reinstatement in the Marine Corps. Any rank, any assignment. As long as it put him back in a cockpit. He walked the letter to a Western Union office and had it transmitted as a telegram to Washington that same night. Within days, the reply came back. Gregory Boyington was reinstated as a major in the United States Marine Corps. He was ordered to report for deployment to the South Pacific. He had begged his way back into the war. But when he arrived in the theater, he found that no one wanted him. He was passed from one command to another: executive officer, administrative officer, ground liaison. He watched younger men fly missions he was not permitted to join. The war was happening on the other side of a barbed wire fence, and the Marine Corps had put him on the wrong side of it. By August of 1943, Boyington was stationed at Turtle Bay Airstrip on the island of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. He was 30 years old. He had not fired a gun in anger for over a year, and he was on the verge of being cut loose by the Marine Corps for the second time in his life. That was when he went to see Sandy Sanderson. Colonel Stanley Sanderson was an old Marine aviator, a friend from before the war, and one of the few senior officers still willing to take a phone call from Gregory Boyington. In a tent on Espiritu Santo, over a bottle of whiskey, the 2 men worked out an idea. The Marine Corps was cycling fighter pilots through the South Pacific faster than it could organize them into squadrons. At any given time, dozens of trained pilots were sitting in the replacement pool at Espiritu Santo, waiting for assignments that had not been written yet. Boyington proposed something that had never been done before. Give him the replacement pool. Let him pick 27 pilots off the beach. Let him form a squadron out of the men nobody else had claimed yet. To everyone's surprise, the request was approved. In early September of 1943, Marine Fighter Squadron 214 was reconstituted on Espiritu Santo under the command of Major Gregory Boyington. The 27 pilots who reported for duty came from everywhere: New England, New Orleans, Florida, California. They had not trained together. They had not flown together. Most of them had never even met. Their ages ranged from 21 to 24. Boyington was 10 years older than the oldest man in the squadron. That is how he got the name. They called him Pappy. The pilots gathered in a tent on Espiritu Santo to pick a name for themselves. Boyington suggested Boyington's Bastards, a reference to the fact that the squadron had been assembled out of orphaned pilots who belonged to no other unit. The men laughed. They liked it. The public relations officer did not laugh. He explained, patiently, that no American newspaper in 1943 would print the word bastard, and a squadron whose name could not appear in print was a squadron the folks back home would never hear about. The men argued. The PR officer held firm. In the end, they compromised. The word bastard would not appear on paper, but the squadron insignia, designed by the pilots themselves, would carry a heraldic symbol called the bar sinister, a diagonal black stripe, in medieval heraldry, the mark of illegitimacy. The bastard stripe. The new name was Black Sheep. The television series that would air 3 decades later would tell the American public that these men were criminals, convicts, and outcasts thrown together because no other squadron would take them. That was a lie invented in a Los Angeles writer's room in 1976. The real Black Sheep were professional Marine fighter pilots. They were young. Most of them had never seen combat, but every one of them had been trained on the F4U Corsair, and under Boyington, they were about to become one of the most efficient killing organizations the Marine Corps ever produced. To understand how, you have to understand the airplane they were about to fight. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was a masterpiece of Japanese engineering. It was light, it was agile. Below 300 miles per hour, no American fighter in the sky could turn with it. Marine pilots who tried to dogfight the Zero on its own terms died in appalling numbers. In some early engagements of the Pacific War, the Zero achieved a kill ratio as high as 12-1 against American aircraft. The Corsair changed the equation. The F4U was heavier than the Zero. It could not turn with it, but it was faster in level flight by 70 to 90 miles per hour. It could outdive anything the Japanese put in the air, and its 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns delivered a weight of fire nearly 3 times greater than the Zero's 220mm cannons and 2 rifle caliber guns. Boyington had learned the answer to the Zero in China with the Flying Tigers. Never turn. Never fight on the enemy's terms. Come down from altitude, fire in a single pass, climb back to the sun. Repeat. The Americans called it boom and zoom. Boyington called it staying alive. On the 16th of September, 1943, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Major Gregory Boyington led 23 Black Sheep pilots off the runway at Munda for their 3rd combat mission. Their assignment was to escort a formation of American bombers against Japanese positions in the Solomons. They ran into 40 Zeros for the next 30 minutes over an area of 250 square miles of Pacific sky. The Black Sheep fought the largest air battle any of them had ever seen. When it ended, they had claimed 11 confirmed victories and 8 probables. Boyington personally shot down 5 enemy fighters in a single mission on his 3rd combat sortie of the war. Ace in a day. His first day of real combat with the Black Sheep. The squadron flew home to Munda in the late afternoon. The mechanics counted the aircraft as they landed. Every Black Sheep Corsair came home. That night, the story went out on the wire services. In small towns from Maine to California, mothers and fathers and wives read the morning newspapers and learned that a Marine squadron called the Black Sheep had done something extraordinary in the South Pacific. Nobody had heard of them. Nobody had heard of their commander. But the numbers were the numbers. 11 kills, 0 losses. A first combat sortie. The war correspondents began arriving at Munda. Over the next 6 weeks, the Black Sheep flew missions almost every day. They escorted Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers over Bougainville. They flew fighter sweeps against Japanese airfields at Kahili and Balale. They strafed enemy shipping in the slot. Their kill count climbed. By the middle of October, they had confirmed 57 aerial victories in 6 weeks of combat. They had also lost 4 pilots. Missing in action, presumed dead. This is the part of the story the Black Sheep never talked about after the war. A fighter squadron in the South Pacific was not a group of aces flying against a defeated enemy. It was a small community of young men who lived together in canvas tents, on coral islands, in equatorial heat, eating Spam and Vienna sausages 3 times a day, sleeping under mosquito netting, drinking whatever they could get their hands on in the evening, and flying missions in the morning from which some percentage of them did not return. When a pilot did not come back, his tentmates went through his footlocker. They divided his cigarettes. They packed his letters for shipment home to his mother. They folded his flight jacket. They did not speak about him again. That was the code. The stabilizing force in the middle of all of this was a former Los Angeles police officer named Frank Walton. Walton was the squadron intelligence officer. He was older than the pilots. He was calm where Boyington was volatile. He debriefed every combat mission, kept the squadron logbook, and, this is the detail history should never forget, wrote a personal letter to the family of every pilot in the squadron, every week, telling them their sons were alive and well. When a pilot died, Walton wrote that letter too, in his own hand. He never delegated it. On the 4th of October, 1943, Boyington led an escort mission over Bougainville. Above the target, the Corsairs met a formation of Japanese fighters climbing to intercept them. Boyington rolled his aircraft into a dive. In the span of 60 seconds, he shot down 3 Zeros. The war correspondents were now filing daily stories about Major Gregory Boyington. The narrative was writing itself. Older man, combat veteran, flying tiger, rough around the edges but deadly in the air. His personal victory count had reached 14. He was closing on the all-time American ace record. The record belonged to a Marine named Joseph Foss. 26 kills, all achieved in the defense of Guadalcanal in 1942 and early 1943. Foss had gone home. Foss had received the Medal of Honor, and Foss's 26 equaled the record set in the previous war by the legendary Eddie Rickenbacker. Boyington was one man closing on 2 ghosts, and America wanted to watch him do it. At the end of the 3rd week in October, the Black Sheep completed their first combat tour. 6 weeks, 57 confirmed kills, 19 probables, 4 dead, 2 wounded, and evacuated. The squadron was ordered to stand down for rest and recreation in Sydney, Australia. The remaining 22 Black Sheep flew south in a Douglas C-47 transport. They landed at Kingsford Smith Aerodrome. They took taxis into King's Cross. They found a bar at the Hotel Australia, where a bartender named Freda ran an unofficial system by which a Marine officer, if he lined up early enough, could receive 4 glasses of Scotch whiskey at the sound of the closing bell. They found young Australian women whose husbands and boyfriends were fighting somewhere else. They slept in beds with sheets. They ate steak. Frank Walton watched and said nothing, and made sure his commanding officer got back to the aerodrome in time to catch the transport home. By the middle of November, the Black Sheep were back at Turtle Bay on Espiritu Santo, preparing for their 2nd combat tour. New pilots had arrived to replace the dead. The squadron roster was up to 40 men. Boyington spent the first 2 weeks working with the new arrivals, explaining the tactics, the discipline, the code. And then, on the last day before the squadron was to deploy forward, an order came down from Group Headquarters. Major Gregory Boyington was being transferred to a non-flying administrative position. The order had been written by a Marine Corps colonel named Joe Smoke. Smoke was everything Boyington was not. Regulation haircut, regulation uniform, a career officer who had spent the war behind a desk and who despised what he saw as Boyington's public relations circus. Smoke believed the Black Sheep were a disgrace to Marine Corps discipline. Their commander was, in his view, a man who was allowed to fly only because the newspapers loved him. Now Smoke had the paperwork to do something about it. Frank Walton read the order. He walked into Boyington's tent. He handed him a slip of paper with a name and a location on it. The name was Brigadier General James Moore. The location was 1st Marine Aircraft Wing Headquarters at Espiritu Santo. Moore was Boyington's oldest surviving friend in the Marine Corps. They had been junior officers together in the 1930s, and on Walton's suggestion, Boyington now went to see him. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Moore made a phone call. Colonel Joe Smoke's transfer order was rescinded. Boyington was placed back in command of Marine Fighter Squadron 214 for the 2nd Combat Tour. When Smoke learned what had happened, he did not accept it quietly. He searched the Marine Corps Regulations Manual until he found an obscure paragraph forbidding junior officers from visiting group headquarters on personal business without authorization. He then had Gregory Boyington placed under arrest and confined to his quarters at Turtle Bay for a period of 2 weeks. While his own squadron loaded onto transports to fly north to the combat zone, the commanding officer of the Black Sheep sat alone in a tent, guarded by a Marine sentry, waiting out his sentence. He did not wait it out. On the morning the sentence was scheduled to end, Boyington packed his flight gear, walked past the sentry, boarded a Douglas transport bound for the forward airstrip at Torokina on Bougainville, and rejoined his squadron in the middle of the 2nd Combat Tour. There is no evidence that anyone in the chain of command ever attempted to prosecute him for it. By that point, Gregory Boyington had become too famous to punish. The 2nd tour began. Torokina was different from Munda. Torokina was inside the war. The airstrip had been carved out of the jungle only weeks earlier. The Japanese held the interior of Bougainville. Artillery shells fell on the perimeter at night. The Marines lived in foxholes and flew from a runway that was still being extended by bulldozers between missions. And from Torokina, the Black Sheep were now within range of the target that had defined the Pacific War for 2 years. The target was Rabaul. Rabaul was the greatest Japanese military installation in the South Pacific. It sat on the northern tip of New Britain, inside a natural harbor formed by a collapsed volcanic caldera. The Japanese combined fleet used it as a forward anchorage. The Imperial Army had garrisoned it with over 100,000 troops. 5 airfields ringed the harbor, hosting over 400 aircraft. Anti-aircraft batteries covered every approach. American planners called Rabaul the fortress. Marine pilots called it the meat grinder. Every fighter sweep the Black Sheep flew. For the next 6 weeks went to Rabaul. They came home with fewer aircraft each time. On the 17th of December, Boyington shot down his 15th confirmed kill of the tour. On the 23rd, he shot down his 21st. By Christmas Day, he was at 24. 26 was the record. The war correspondents at Torokina had grown from 3 to 12. They interviewed him after every mission. They photographed him climbing out of the cockpit. Life magazine sent a reporter. The Associated Press sent a wire photographer. When Boyington came back from a sortie with an empty gun camera, the correspondents wanted to know why. When he came back with a kill, they wanted to know how. The pressure on a 31-year-old man who had already been carrying too much for too long was becoming something that no one, including Boyington himself, had a name for. On the 27th of December, he wrote a letter to his mother in Idaho. "The Japanese are getting pretty tough out here," he wrote. "I don't know whether I will be able to break Joe Foss's record before I go home or not. As you have always taught me, nothing is worthwhile unless you earn it." Between the 23rd of December and the 3rd of January, over a span of 11 days, the Black Sheep Squadron lost 8 pilots. 8 men, out of a forward deployed strength of 40, killed or missing in less than 2 weeks. Their tents were emptied. Their footlockers were searched. Frank Walton wrote 8 letters home, and Gregory Boyington, 25 kills, 1 behind the record, kept flying. The morning of January 3rd, 1944, came to Torokina airstrip without wind. The Pacific was flat. The sky above Bougainville was clear all the way to the horizon. Meteorologists at the field weather station reported unlimited visibility. For a fighter pilot chasing a record, it was the kind of morning that comes once in a war. Gregory Boyington had gone to bed early the night before. He had slept for 6 straight hours, the longest uninterrupted sleep he had managed in a month. When his orderly woke him at 5:30 in the morning, Boyington was already awake. He put on his flight suit. He walked to the mess tent. He ate powdered eggs and drank black coffee. He walked to the operations tent for the pre-mission briefing, and at 6:30 on the morning of January 3rd, he climbed into the cockpit of his F4U 1A Corsair. His wingman that day was Captain George Ashmun. Ashmun was a young officer who had been with the Black Sheep since the first tour. He was quiet. He was reliable. He was one of the best formation pilots in the squadron. Ashmun had asked personally to fly wing for Boyington on this mission. He wanted to be there when Pappy broke the record. The target was Rabaul. 48 American aircraft climbed out of Torokina and joined into the strike formation. Marine and Navy Corsairs, Army Air Force Lightnings, Grumman Hellcats. Their assignment was a fighter sweep over the Japanese airfields at Lakunai and Vunakanau. Find enemy aircraft. Destroy enemy aircraft. Come home. Boyington flew at the front of the formation. The strike crossed the coast of New Britain at 9:15 in the morning. Below them, Simpson Harbor opened into view. Warships at anchor, freighters unloading, anti-aircraft batteries opening up from the volcanic ridges. Above the harbor, dozens of Japanese fighters were already climbing to meet them. Some accounts say there were 40 Zeros, some say 60. Boyington himself, in the memoir he would write 15 years later, said only that there were more of them than he had ever seen in one place before. He rolled in, he fired, at the lead zero of a climbing formation. The zero exploded. His wingman Ashmun confirmed the kill on the radio in a single word. 26. In that instant, over the harbor, at Rabaul, Gregory Boyington tied the American all-time ace record. Somewhere at Torokina, 1,200 miles away, a war correspondent from the Associated Press was already writing the lead paragraph of the story he would file that evening. Marine ace Boyington ties Rickenbacker over Rabaul. The story would never run. What happened next has been reconstructed by historians from 3 sources. Boyington's own memoir, published in 1958. Combat reports filed by the other Black Sheep pilots who returned to Torokina that afternoon, and the recollections of Japanese Navy pilots interviewed after the war who had flown against him that morning. The 3 sources agree on the sequence. Boyington and Ashmun became separated from the main formation. They found themselves alone at 18,000 feet in a sky that was full of Japanese fighters. Ashmun's Corsair was hit first. The Zeros came from above and behind. His aircraft caught fire. He did not radio a distress call. His Corsair went into a slow-burning spiral towards Simpson Harbor. Boyington saw it happen. He turned back to cover his wingman. By the time he reached Ashmun's aircraft, it was too late for Ashmun, and now it was too late for Boyington. Several Zeros had positioned themselves above and behind him. They opened fire simultaneously. 20mm cannon shells struck the engine of the Corsair. The great Pratt and Whitney R-2800 The 2,000 horsepower engine that had made the F4U the fastest fighter in the Pacific began to burn. The cockpit filled with smoke. The Corsair rolled inverted at 8,000 feet. Boyington unbuckled his harness, kicked the canopy release, and fell out of the burning aircraft into the sky above Rabaul. His parachute opened at 4,000 feet. He landed in the water of St. George's Channel, 6 miles offshore from the greatest Japanese naval base in the South Pacific. He inflated his Mae West life vest. His scalp was cut. His left leg was torn open. His left arm had been hit by shell fragments and would not raise above his shoulder. Salt water burned in the wounds. Above him, a Japanese Zero circled at low altitude. The pilot could see him clearly in the water. It was not uncommon at that point in the war for Japanese pilots to strafe enemy airmen in the sea. Boyington waited for the machine guns to open fire. They did not. The Zero climbed away and disappeared to the north. Boyington floated in the Pacific for 4 hours. He would later write in his memoir that sharks circled him more than once, and that he beat them back with a small revolver he carried in his flight vest. He watched the sun climb toward noon. He heard in the distance the engines of American aircraft returning south to Torokina. He tried to wave. Nobody saw him. At Torokina, the black sheep landed one by one. The mechanics counted the Corsairs as they came in. Then the pilots gathered in the operations tent for debriefing. Frank Walton took the reports. Nobody had seen what happened to the commanding officer after he broke formation to cover Ashmoon. Nobody had seen a parachute. Nobody had heard a distress call. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the fuel tanks of a Corsair with a full combat load were empty. Boyington's aircraft had been empty for an hour. He was not coming. The war correspondent from the Associated Press closed his notebook. The mechanics walked away from the flight line. Frank Walton went to his tent, sat down at a wooden table, and began writing a letter to Boyington's mother in Idaho. That evening, 4 Black Sheep pilots got into their Corsairs without authorization and flew north toward Rabaul at dusk, looking for their commanding officer in the ocean. They found nothing. They returned after dark, having flown on fumes. Nothing was said to them about the unauthorized flight. 5 days later, on the 8th of January, Marine Fighter 214 completed its second combat tour and was ordered off the line. The squadron had flown for 84 days. It had shot down 94 Japanese aircraft in the air and destroyed 21 on the ground. It had produced 9 aces, including its commanding officer. It had lost 12 pilots, killed or missing in action. The Black Sheep were disbanded. The pilots were reassigned to other squadrons. The name was retired. In Washington, the paperwork worked its way through the Navy Department. On March 4, 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the recommendation. The Medal of Honor was to be awarded to Major Gregory Boyington, United States Marine Corps, posthumously, in memory of a pilot presumed dead. The medal was placed in a wooden case in the Navy Department, awaiting delivery to Boyington's mother in Idaho. It sat there for 19 months. What no one at Torokina knew, and no one in Washington knew, was that Gregory Boyington had been picked out of the Pacific Ocean at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the day he went down. He had been spotted by the crew of a Japanese submarine returning to Rabaul from patrol. The submarine surfaced. Sailors pulled him from the water at gunpoint. They tied his hands. They took him below. For the next 20 months, the man the American press called dead was a prisoner of the Empire of Japan. He was taken first to a naval interrogation center on Rabaul, then to the island of Truk, then, eventually, to the home islands of Japan. In March of 1944, he arrived at a Funa prison camp, a naval intelligence interrogation facility outside the city of Kamakura, near Yokohama. Ofuna did not exist on any Red Cross registry. The prisoners at Ofuna were not registered as prisoners of war. Their families were never notified. As far as the government of the United States was concerned, every man in Ofuna was already dead. Boyington was interrogated. He was beaten. He was starved. His weight fell from 190 pounds to 130. He crossed paths there with another American prisoner named Louis Zamperini, a former Olympic runner who had been a bombardier on a B-24 Liberator, whose aircraft had gone down in the Pacific in May of 1943, and whose story would one day be told in another book, in another film. In the camp, Zamperini kept the other prisoners' minds off the food by writing out from memory the Italian recipes his mother had taught him as a boy. Boyington would remember those recipes for the rest of his life. In the spring of 1945, Boyington was transferred to Omori prison camp on an artificial island in Tokyo Bay. From Omori, the prisoners could see the fires of Tokyo burning at night as the American B-29 bombers came in from the Marianas. During the prisoners were marched out into the ruined streets of the city to clear rubble from the previous night's raid. They were fed a cup of rice and a bowl of watery soup. Men died of dysentery. Men died of beatings. Boyington did not. On the 15th of August, 1945, the Emperor of Japan spoke on the radio and announced his country's surrender. 2 weeks later, on the 29th of August, an American Navy mercy party sailed into Tokyo Bay. It was led by Commander Harold Stassen, a former 3-term governor of the state of Minnesota, now serving on the staff of Admiral William F. Halsey. Stassen had been given the specific mission of finding, evacuating, and caring for the American prisoners of war held on the Japanese home islands. Omori was his first stop. Stassen came ashore in a landing craft. Emaciated prisoners in rags came out of the barracks and stood in the sunlight, blinking. One of them was Major Gregory Boyington, United States Marine Corps, aged 32, whom the entire United States of America had believed dead for a year and 8 months. Stassen recognized him. He had followed the story in the newspapers back home. He walked up to Boyington, and what he said in that moment has been remembered in every history of the Pacific War written since. He said, "We thought you were dead, Pappy." The news reached Washington within hours. On October 5th, 1945, in a ceremony at the White House, President Harry S. Truman stood in front of Major Gregory Boyington and read the citation for the Medal of Honor. Frank Walton was there. Several of the surviving black sheep were there. The medal that had sat in a wooden case in the Navy Department for 19 months was placed around the neck of a living man. 2 weeks later, the Navy also awarded him the Navy Cross for the same Rabaul mission on which he had been shot down. The Marine Corps flew Boyington and Walton across the country on a war bond tour. In every city, crowds turned out. In Seattle, the city closed the streets. The black sheep were located, one by one, in the demobilization camps. The Marine Corps flew them all to San Francisco and put them up at the St. Francis Hotel. Boyington had told them, on a bombing raid over Rabaul in December of 1943, that if he ever went down over the Pacific, they should not worry about him. He would meet them for a drink at the St. Francis Hotel after the war. He kept the promise. The party lasted 3 days. That was the peak of Gregory Boyington's life. Everything that came after was a slow descent. He remained in the Marine Corps for a short time. He was promoted to colonel on the retired list in 1947. His first marriage had already ended. His second marriage ended. His third marriage ended. His drinking, which had been heavy for most of his adult life, became catastrophic in the 1950s. He worked as a beer salesman. He worked as a professional wrestling referee. He appeared on quiz shows to pay his rent. His children barely spoke to him. In 1958, he published a memoir called Bar Bar Black Sheep. It sold well. He was honest in it, in a way that most military memoirs are not. He described his alcoholism. He described his failures as a husband. He described his fear. The book is still in print. In 1976, the American Broadcasting Company purchased the rights and turned it into a television series. The black sheep of the television series were criminals, drunks, and misfits. They flew Corsairs against Japanese Zeros in a South Pacific that had almost no relation to the actual South Pacific. Robert Conrad played Boyington. The show ran for 2 seasons. It made Boyington famous a second time, 30 years after the first. The surviving black sheep hated the show. Frank Walton wrote a book to correct the record. Boyington himself said, in an interview near the end of his life, that he took the money and tried not to watch it. In the last decade of his life, he stopped drinking. He remarried, for the 4th time, to a woman named Josephine, who kept him sober. He went to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. He spoke, quietly, at Marine Corps reunions. He answered letters from school children who had watched the television show. He grew a white beard. He looked, in the photographs from those years, like a man at peace. Gregory Boyington died on the 11th of January, 1988, in Fresno, California. He was 75 years old. He was buried, 6 days later, at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The Marine Corps supplied the pallbearers. A Corsair from the Confederate Air Force flew overhead at low altitude. Its Pratt & Whitney engine made the sound the Japanese had once called whistling death. Frank Walton was there. He was one of the last of the black sheep to speak at the graveside. Many of the 27 pilots who had flown with Boyington in the Solomons were buried in the same cemetery in the years that followed. By the second decade of the 21st century, all of them were gone. The Corsair itself had been retired from frontline American combat service by the mid-1950s. The Marine Corps flew it in Korea, the French flew it in Indochina. And in 1969, in the last known combat use of a propeller-driven fighter anywhere in the world, the Corsair fought once more, in a brief war in Central America, before the last of them went into museums. You can still see one in Washington, D.C. Its wings bend downward and then level off. Its cowl is painted in the markings of the United States Marine Corps. Behind the cockpit, if you know where to look, you can find a diagonal black stripe. The bar sinister, the bastard's mark, the insignia of a squadron of young men who lived in tents on Coral Islands in 1943, who flew a fighter the Navy had rejected against an enemy who was supposed to be unbeatable, and who followed into combat a 31-year-old flying tiger with a fake name and a bar tab he could not pay. They shot down 94 Japanese airplanes in 84 days. 12 of them did not come home, and their commanding officer came back from the dead. That is the true story of the Black Sheep. That is the true story of the F4U Corsair. That is the true story of Gregory Boyington. A man who was never quite the hero the newspapers wrote about, and never quite the failure the men who raised him thought he would become. Who was buried, in the end, among the greatest soldiers this country has ever produced. Who earned that grave the hard way, in the sky over Rabaul, in the mud at Ofuna, in the long, silent years afterward, when the war was over, and there was nothing left to fight but himself. He fought that war too. And in the end, he won.